Welcome to the DPM podcast, where we go beyond theory to give expert PM advice for leading better digital projects. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Aston, founder of The Digital Project Manager. Now, if there's one thing that derails almost every project, it's scope creep. We all know it's bad. We all know we want to avoid it. But how do you know it in all its various guises? What causes it? Whose fault is it? And most importantly, how do you actually deal with it? All be revealed in today's podcast, where we're talking about controlling creeps of the project scope variety. This podcast is brought to you by Clarizen, the leader in enterprise project and portfolio management software. Visit clarizen.com to learn more. I'm with Suze Haworth today. Suze is one of our resident DPM experts at the Digital Project Manager, and she works as a freelance senior digital project manager in London, in the UK. She's got more than 10 years experience working in agencies, and she's experienced a lot of scope creep. So she's a great person to be talking with us today. Suze, welcome.
Hi, Ben.
So, Suze, we were just chatting before we started recording. Can you tell us a bit about the kind of projects you're working on at the moment and, some of the challenges that you're facing?
Yes, so I'm currently working in an agency in London freelancing. So I'm sort of split between a senior project manager and project director role across two accounts. So one of them I'm working on for IKEA. So sort of large retail e-commerce company, and we're doing a design system for them, sort of prototype design system. And then I'm working on also Specsavers, another e-commerce retailer in the UK. So a lot of retail projects at the moment. And challenges, I guess. Oh, it's always hard to talk about the challenges of your projects, especially when they're live. Yeah, I think...
Is it that pesky client?
Yeah, no, actually, they're really... I have to say this anyway.
Yeah, you do.
No, it's true. They're very good clients I'm working with at the moment. I think this is the sort of good and bad thing about projects and being a project manager in general, is just working with people. So it's great. I love working with people, different characters and quirks and that, but also... you do sometimes get to a point where you get a bit frustrated with struggling to try and get stuff out of people who don't want to do stuff and things like that. So, yeah, I've had a bit of that recently, I think.
Fun and games. So, tell us about the project to build a design system, because I think that's an interesting project. And actually, it's the kind of project that we're seeing more of, whereas previously, perhaps everyone liked to treat every kind of project as a special snowflake and, the creatives wanted to be creative. So talk us through, what is a design system and how do you, what is the project that you're actually working on and how are you kind of rolling that out?
Yeah, so it's a really exciting one actually, because like you said, design systems are coming sort of more and more into play in the digital world. And they basically are like a bit of a style library, I guess, for the digital design for companies and brands. So what they do is set a baseline of designed components, modules, templates that any designer or developer that sort of work with their brand can take and use to develop their own designs and code from that. So it's kind of a baseline. So setting the baseline design, and that sort of promotes efficiency. So, reusable code and designs, and also just sort of efficiency and consistency within the company. So where somebody like IKEA is a huge brand and has many sort of different agencies, people, organizations working for them, that sort of design system can set a standard that designers and developers can work with, so that, the button on a page, a call to action, can be consistent across multiple platforms, devices, etc., and apps, whatever sort of properties they're using.
So talk me through the kind of the process then of I guess managing the projects, because it's it could kind of be like a how long is a piece of string kind of project. Like how do you, is it something where you're just what did you start with and kind of what are you iterating on and where does the project end?
Yeah, so for IKEA, a lot of brands don't actually, they do this as an internal project. So IKEA have kind of looked outside externally for sort of support and help on this, and for us to be involved in the design. I think that's a really smart move, because we can kind of come in as the outsiders and review things with a bit more of a not sort of ingrained in the company approach. But we started out looking sort of conceptually at sort of setting the principles, the core digital principles, the kind of concept behind our design, IKEA's sort of brand principles, design principles. So that was the kind of setup. So it was a more strategic kind of look at the whole kind of experience and design principles behind it. And then we started to get more granular into design. So setting a baseline design based on existing kind of foundational elements, we call them. So things like color, typography, grids, and then kind of develop that further. We then did some user testing with that design against a few sort of platforms that we picked from IKEA's range of properties. And then we've kind of gone on from there into designing and building specific components and then hosting them on a design system site, which is just kind of internal at the moment, because what we're looking at is more of a sort of prototype to initially kind of get this up and running, and then it'll be developed into a full solution sort of once we get to the end of this stage.
Cool. So what does that full solution look like? Is it a kind of living, breathing style guide with snippets that people can just grab, or kind of templates that they can grab? Is that kind of where it's headed?
Yeah, I think any design system project needs to be an ongoing living thing. So it's not got a finite end. It's not kind of a product that you just stop with and then that's it. So it does need to be developed with, I mean, we've just started and sort of scratched the surface in terms of the initial principles, foundations and components. But from there, it's sort of grouping those components, developing modules, then sort of templates as well. And then looking at sort of how you get people using this, I guess, and sort of circulating it, getting people onboarded with it. So there's this huge, huge project, especially with the sort of amount of different parties involved in the company. So yeah, so we just sort of almost just kicked off, even though it's been sort of almost a year so far.
Cool. Sounds like a fun one. So I'm always curious to ask people whether or not they found any tools recently, or, you know, what's making your life awesome at the moment? Is there anything that you found, anything that you've read? What have you discovered recently that other people should know about?
Not so much. You've been using different tools recently, to be honest. Sticking with what I know. But this is probably ironically considering I'm on a podcast, but I've been listening to a lot more podcasts recently. Yeah, so usually I listen to music on the way into work and out sort of on the commute, but recently I've actually been instead sort of using it a little bit more usefully, but listening to a range of podcasts, which has been really good because it's another sort of way to learn and obviously use the time when I'm standing on the tube. I was going to say sitting, but I never get a seat. Standing on the tube to work. Yeah, so using that quite usefully.
What are there any podcasts that you found really helpful or interesting?
I have to say the Digital Project Manager podcast, definitely. Okay, that's a given. And then I actually did a podcast recently calls it The Drunken PM. So that's Dave Pryor, who sort of talks a lot about Agile. So after my DPM Summit session I did recently, I spoke to him about what my session was about. And then the Bureau of Digital also, who run the DPM Summit, they do some good ones. And Brett, who runs the Summit, Brett Harnett, has sort of recently put out one called Sprints and Milestones, which is based on his book around digital project management. So also quite a useful resource.
Good stuff. So get listening to your podcasts. One thing that I've found really interesting, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called Blinkist, and it's, do you know what, I have to be honest, I don't listen to a lot, if any, podcasts other than my own where I talk. So but one of the things that I always find is that I always think, I should really read that book, and then I either buy the book and then never get around to reading it, or just never get around to it. But yeah, Blinkist has this thing, it's where basically they're very condensed summaries of books. So it's kind of like
I have heard of it actually, yeah.
Yeah, so it basically takes, I think it takes about 15 minutes to read, or you can hear it read out. Someone's kind of reading the summary of the book, the main points. So it's kind of like a podcast. And the great thing about it is that you can speed it up as well. So not only can you play it in normal speed, but you can play it in double speed too. Then it only takes 7.5 minutes to read a book or listen to a book.
That's amazing. I need to try that because I've also been trying to read a bit more recently. Trying to fit in more books would be good.
Yeah, that's my kind of book hack for you all, Blinkist. Cool. Anyway, we're supposed to be talking today about scope creep. So let's talk about scope creep. And for the uninitiated, for those who haven't heard about scope creep, what is it and why should we care about it?
Yeah, so it's basically when your scope, obviously, so your deliverables, anything you've agreed to, features on a project, they basically expand or grow from what you originally agreed to. And that's without accounting for them in terms of extra time. Project can be affected by this because it could come in a variety of formats, but just where sort of things start to slip in or creep in, and where they sort of come in and extend timings and make things slip within your project.
Cool. So it's additional work that we hadn't accounted for, And then that is going to have an impact on our budget, on our timeline, and obviously the scope, the amount of work we're doing it. So there's lots of reasons why this happens, right? There's lots of reasons why the work that we thought we were going to do or plan to do suddenly becomes, there's more of it. Like we're very good at creating work for ourselves. So, I mean, in the article that you've written, we're not going to talk through all the reasons of what causes it, but because there's a whole host of reasons why this happens.
Yes.
but what would you say for you, what are the most typical or the most, let's talk about the most typical, and then let's talk about the kind of most sneaky.
Yeah. So I guess the most common ones I've seen, firstly, not sort of being clear about the scope in the first place. So when you're setting out deliverables and writing a statement of work at the beginning of a project, if you're sort of too vague or loose with how you describe things, or how you haven't got quite a tight definition around what you are actually delivering, that can obviously come back later, and you can, anyone like the client or even internally, people could actually take that and take it, and it means very different things. So then it starts to, the scope of the project starts to grow based on sort of quite a vague kind of setting of the deliverables up front. So I think that's the first one, is sort of being clear about scope up front. And also just making sure that whoever is signing off this scope is very clear on what they're getting. So statement of works are great, obviously, in terms of laying out all the deliverables and what you're doing with the project. But obviously, they're quite a long document. You're sort of giving them to a client and expecting them to read and digest and understand everything within that. So it's really important to make sure that the core points and the core things that they're getting within the project and timings and budget are really pulled out and explained to them explicitly. Even if you think they have read it, they do go very granular in their feedback. It's really important, I think, when you are delivering an initial kind of scope for a project, is to work that through with them in a meeting. Just make sure they do understand what they are getting. So that's where I've seen a lot of problems in the past as well, where a statement of work is agreed to, and then people down the line are just like, oh, but I thought I was getting that, even though it might sort of be more explicit up front.
Yeah. So there's us not being clear at the beginning. We might say something like, hey, yes, client, we're going to create for you a page template, but we don't define fully, okay, what actually goes in the template. Or often I think that one of the challenges is, and this is kind of what you talked about with the second thing, so we're not clear, or it's just that it's a communication thing, right? Like we haven't made it clear to the client what we mean by a template.
Yeah, so exactly. So it's the two things there, which is setting and understanding the deliverables clearly up front, but then making sure that whoever is signing off the scope really understands what you've said as well. So that's the kind of second layer to it. Because even if you are quite explicit, it might be that they've still got an idea of something else that they are getting, which you haven't actually even written in your scope.
Yeah. So those are, I think, what you've covered off there, not being clear, the client not understanding. I think they're probably the two most kind of typical kind of instances of how scope creep comes about.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the more sneaky side of it. Like what have you found the most kind of unusual, or, the kind of scope creep that happens without you realizing? How kind of tell us about how that comes about in your experience on the projects you've worked on?
Yeah, so I think the typical way to see scope creep with PMs is that it's the client. The client's going to ask for something else or extend things or want something more all the time. But actually, I've seen it that it can come from internal teams and internal stakeholders as well. So your internal team members, if they don't have a clear understanding of what they're doing, they kind of go off in different directions and just, without realizing, extend the timings of what they're doing, extend functionality. So a designer could just design something that actually hasn't been thought through in terms of how that's going to affect the development scope, if you sort of set that up front. So they could just be doing that quite unintentionally, or they could have a different agenda almost, so that they want to build something. I've seen this before as well, where they actually want to almost shoehorn something they want to design or build into that. So it's probably a bit more surprising when it comes from internally, because you kind of want everyone on the same page, but it can happen. And then also sort of other internal stakeholders, there can be kind of business needs kind of worked into that. So It might be that internal stakeholders want you to deliver more from a client relationship point of view, or they might agree to stuff that you weren't aware of. That's also another classic. So yeah, I think that's where the kind of slightly sneakier ones, I guess, come in.
Yeah, no, I think I totally agree with that in terms of one of the most causes of kind of sneaky scope creep is it's when it's internal, when it's gold plating, when it's our own internal teams trying to put this gold plating on what they're doing. So, and often happens with strategy and UX and design, but it can happen in development as well when someone wants to do a really awesome job, or someone's thinking, hey, I think we can make this is going to be a showpiece, this is going to be something that we can submit to awards, so let's put in the extra effort. But then no one's ever really had that conversation. Okay, well, who's paying for this additional work? Or
exactly.
Who's taking responsibility for this? So going rogue is definitely definitely
good way to put it.
Where you have independent thinkers coming up with their own interpretation of what you're asking them to do. And I think another one that I want to talk about, which you mentioned in your article, is QA as well. When we're in that quality assurance phase, but perhaps we haven't defined, when we're writing the user story at the beginning, we haven't fully defined the acceptance criteria, or we haven't defined with QA, hey guys, don't worry about testing on IE9, we don't care about IE9 anymore. And the QA team are like, yeah, but there's loads of bugs with IE9, so we should do it. Or you find out they're testing on BlackBerry or something random like that, and all of a sudden, not only are they spending loads of time testing stuff that we don't care about, but we forgot to tell them. But then also you have the developers trying to fix things that don't actually need fixing. I don't know if you found that too.
Oh, completely. So QA is one of the big areas of projects, especially more sort of waterfall linear projects, where you kind of can estimate at the beginning roughly based on what you know about the development period of time. But it's really hard, obviously, to estimate for how much QA there is in terms of how many amends there are to re-QA, retest. So that can just kind of enlarge, especially if you don't set those parameters up front. So like you said, sort of setting the acceptance criteria, setting your browser and device matrix, and setting your priority on your bugs and sort of issues that come up. So what are the ones you have to fix to be able to release? What are the ones that are priority, sort of lower priority, so 2, 3, 4, that you could actually release without addressing? So maybe sort of more design or surface amends. So it's kind of, again, it's about sort of defining that clear scope for things as much as you can. So taking away that uncertainty up front. But again, I think with this, and it is all about throughout sort of any sort of project, it's really about sort of core communication and keeping the communication open. So with the client, if you are sort of going to QA and you're finding that there's more time being spent one device, which is a nightmare, one browser, like IE, that could be a nightmare. It's about sort of being upfront and sort of exposing that sort of very quickly to the client or stakeholder. So telling them that IE, for example, is causing a lot more time for the QA. We can, and then sort of suggest some alternatives to that. So we've got these browser and devices to cover. We can prioritize IE because it's really important, and we know that the user base is huge for you for IE. So prioritize that and continue with that, and then we'll sort of treat the other browsers as lower priority. So it's kind of about looking at exposing any sort of issues where you see the scope creeping as quickly as you can, but also providing alternative solutions when you do expose the kind of scope creep that could be happening.
I like that. I think that's really helpful. So we've talked about a couple of things that cause scope creep, the unclear scope, going rogue, QA, and let's talk about whose fault is it, because in order to deal with it, I think it often helps if we kind of identify who's at fault here, not so that much we can point fingers, but more that we can work out how we deal with it. So, the two that we've talked about is the client, the client's asking for more stuff. Maybe they're asking for more stuff because they weren't clear about it, about what we were delivering. We've talked about our internal stakeholders and our team gold plating stuff and creating more work for ourselves. But you mentioned some other kind of parties in your article as well. Third parties, users, and us as project managers. So what do you, I'm keen to talk about us as project managers. That's most of who we have listening is project managers. So to what extent is this our problem and our fault? Is it our problem or is it everyone else's problem?
I guess when you're looking at, it's not sort of blaming sort of whoever for the scope creep. It's really sort of trying to ascertain the risks. So if you're looking at who the people are within your project who could cause the scope creep and sort of what they can do, and it's really a good way of sort of looking at the risks up front, so what people could do down the line. And when it comes to you, I think obviously we tend to look outwards in terms of, what could the team do, sort of how could they increase things, look at the client as an obvious one, etc. But I think with you personally, it's about sort of not flagging or highlighting when things do happen. So I think there can be a tendency, and I hold my hands up, I've done it in the past, where if there's an issue on a project, you kind of want to try and solve it, but kind of bury it and not just constantly, especially if there's a lot of issues on a project, constantly be flagging them to the client or kind of exposing yourself to that sort of negative slant on what's happening. So you kind of almost want to do your best to keep the project going, and you know, battling against the timings, and you want to get things out. So you kind of think, okay, well, we can count for that here, or we can count for that here, but you're not exposing that to the client at that point because you want to try and solve it. And I think that's a really big area where we can actually do better, I think. And I have thought this in the past for myself. So it's a much easier conversation to have with somebody if you're, I think, honest and open about it, and you've raised the issue if it is an issue quickly, and you can talk through it. And I think there it's really important, like I said previously, to be able to present solutions. So not just raising, we've got a problem, and then kind of flounder a bit as you try and work out what to do about it with the client. It's kind of, right, recognizing first we've got a problem. What is the problem? If it is sort of based on a problem, and then going to the client with a few alternative solutions about it. So if the creep has come from an internal basis, you can work through and sort of see what you can do to pull it back, but sort of flag to the client still that it's happened. If the client is asking for something which is over and above what you've agreed, you know, don't just try and swallow it and account for it just to sort of please, you know, like have a look at the impact it will have, and then make sure you've got kind of a few different options worked out. And then you can go back to the client and discuss that impact and what they might want to deprioritize, for example.
Yeah. And so we kind of jumped to talking about how we deal with it. I mean, and that's totally fine, because I think, you know, as we think about, you know, what causes it, this is what we're talking about here is, you know, once we've actually ascertained that there is some scope creep happening, what do we deal with it? But I also think as PMs, kind of going back to the causes of the issue, as PMs, we can try to be clearer with our scope. And I think it's always like asking one of your PM buddies to have a look. Often asking QA. Yeah. QA are great at kind of finding holes in what you've written and like, but have you thought about this? Or one of the business analysts, they're great at kind of picking holes in scope and saying, hey, have you thought about this? Or why haven't you kind of defined this? So being clear with the scope, and then that communication aspect as well that we talked about earlier, being better at not just throwing a statement of work over the wall and kind of hoping for the best, hoping that the client signs it and then it comes back and we're like, yay, we can get started on the project, but actually talking it through with them, I think is really useful in stopping it from happening in the first place. But I like what you're talking about in terms of how we deal with it. You're talking about, hey, don't just kind of sweep it under the carpet. And I think as PMs, we can often think, hey, especially if we're kind of client facing too, there's this temptation to not address and not be proactive about it because like, hey, it might be all right. We want to retain the relationship with the client. That's really important. So we're not transparent about it to start with, and then it becomes too much of an issue. And what you talk about in the post, you know, being proactive, being transparent about it, prioritizing, analyzing the impacts, I think is all really helpful stuff. Mm-hmm. But one thing I want to talk about, which you kind of touched on in your article, is, you know, what we've been talking about here in terms of scope creep is kind of often a challenge that people associate with, you know, waterfall projects where you do lots of planning up front and then you kind of execute phase by phase. But is this a problem too for agile projects? And, you know, and what does that look like with an agile project? What scope creep? What should people be looking out for on an agile project that's kind of more iterative and that's, you know, seemingly more flexible? Yeah,
so that's what I really did want to get across in my article, was that the thing is we see scope creep as quite a negative because we're trying to sort of keep things to a fixed scope that we've agreed, and we're trying to battle against kind of anything changing that. And what's great about agile and using agile methodologies is that it's really about embracing change. It's one of the core principles of agile, and it's about change actually creates, and embracing change creates a better product or service in the end. So actually you're doing sort of something quite good by allowing change into your project. So so my point sort of around that is about change sort of not being seen as the enemy. It's actually quite a good thing when you look at it. It's just how you handle that that you need to be worried about, I guess. But in terms of how it can actually come in agile projects, when you sort of look at maybe a Scrum based project as an example. So you will still, it's an agile project, but you still agree what you're doing for your time box period, your sprint in this example. So you will set that, set what goes in your backlog. So it might be that your product owner or the client you're working with on this could come in sort of during a sprint and sort of add something in or try and add something into the backlog when you've already kind of planned it out or already agreed to what's going in it. And that can affect what you're going to deliver and affect the release. So it's just being careful about sort of what they introduce in isn't just coming in addition to everything else. It's almost you need to look and reprioritize based on that and make sure the amount of effort for the stories or epics you're bringing in can actually be balanced out by deprioritizing something else. So it does still happen, but I think the great thing about Agile is obviously with the smaller time box periods when you're releasing something, you can probably deal with the introduction of changes a little bit better.
Yeah, no, I really like that. Changing the conversation. And you kind of talked about this, embracing change. And I think often when we talk about scope creep, it can often be a very negative conversation. And it's a negative conversation because it means scope creep typically means more cost. It means we're going to turn around to the client and say, hey, you're asking us for this thing, this additional thing. This was not originally planned for. And so it's going to take additional time. It's going to take additional budget. But I think having a more kind of transparent and kind of ongoing dialogue with the clients around the reality and the constraints of their budget mean that we can only do so much, and being able to prioritize with them and have that kind of prioritization as an ongoing discussion so that they don't need to worry about the fact that, hey, they might not get this piece of functionality that they thought they kind of wanted at the start, but within the process of the project, we've kind of actually identified something that's more important. That change is good change to have. And I think we can have that as a conversation throughout the project and not just springing it on the clients at the 11th hour. Oh, sorry, you either need to pay us more money or you can't have that thing and we'll do X instead of Y. That's when it becomes very negative. But I like what you're talking about in terms of an ongoing dialogue that really helps smooth out that conversation.
Yeah, and completely. So I think it's really important to have these conversations around what you are delivering, like you say, on an ongoing basis, because what it should relate back to really is what is going to be most beneficial for the users who are using your product or service in the end. Yeah. And to have these conversations, so instead of saying if the client or whoever's coming in and saying, well, we actually want this, don't just think, oh God, no, we've already planned this, that's it. And just say, no, we can't do that unless you pay us more money, and it'll extend your timings. Maybe have a think about it and just start framing it and shaping it in the way, okay, so what you want, what is the benefit to the users? Why is this coming in as a requirement now? Are we addressing a new need? What are the reasons behind it? And then if it is sort of valid and is actually going to be something that proves a lot more useful to the users, then sort of start to balance that against other deliverables and sort of see, okay, well, this feature that we want to introduce is actually going to be much more useful than this other one. Let's deprioritize that instead. So it's about having those ongoing conversations, keeping the client really involved in what you're doing. And if there are sort of new requests, just analysing them and working out why they're being requested and what is the actual end benefit of them.
Yeah. No, I think that's really sound advice. Make it a conversation and think about the user, I think is really solid advice. And I think what we've been discussing has been great. And I think what's really, resonated with me is that changing this conversation from a negative one to one that's an ongoing dialogue. Like scope creep doesn't have to be a negative thing. It can be good. It can be good for the users. It can be good for the client, for the project and our teams too. So it isn't something that we should necessarily run a million miles away from and be scared of, but embracing it, I think, is really solid advice. But in terms of thinking about people who are like, hey, my big problem is for all my projects, they always end up over budget. They're always late. And we just have these massive scope creep problems. I think this will probably be most PMs, particularly when they're at the beginning of managing projects. This is what they'll be faced with. It's, hey, the project's just going over. Everything's taking longer. We're gold plating everything. The client's asking for more stuff. What's the kind of one tip that you would give someone who seemingly their project's kind of run away with them? What's your kind of first tip for reining that back in?
I think if you are sort of coming into a project new, so it is like a project which is just kicking off, the best thing to try and work on is the actual estimation and sort of how you are sort of scoping for that project. So making sure that you're not just working in a silo, you're estimating with the team, you're making sure your estimates are as good as they possibly can be, bearing in mind they are estimates, so that when it comes to actually delivering what you've scoped for, you're not suddenly finding your timings and budget running away from you. In terms of if you're coming into a project new and it's an ongoing project, I think just sort of taking stock of where you're at, seeing sort of how far you're over and making sure you've got an accurate picture of what's left to do, and then having that conversation with the client. So making sure that you're talking to the client around the issues with it, where it is sort of over, and then just flagging that so that you are having those open conversations.
Cool. Well, Suze, thanks so much for joining us. It's been great having you with us. And as one of our DPM experts, Suze is also going to be making an appearance in our upcoming course. Starting in February, it's called Mastering Digital Project Management. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, but you need some PM training, check it out. It's a 7-week crash course that includes interactive video lessons, assignments, webinars, group discussions, and the option of coaching sessions too. Head to dpmschool.com and get yourself signed up before the course fills up. And if you'd like to contribute to this conversation about scope creep, comment on the post and head to the resources section of the digitalprojectmanager.com to join our Slack team, where you'll find all kinds of interesting conversations going on. But until next time, thanks for listening.